Sarah Mitchell had always been different from other girls in her small Texas town. While her friends spent their afternoons at the mall or gossiping about boys, she preferred the quiet solitude of the old barn behind her grandfather's house. It was there, among the dusty hay bales and forgotten farm equipment, that she discovered something that would change her life forever. Her grandfather, Thomas Mitchell, was a man of few words, but many stories. He had served in World War II, though he rarely spoke about those days. What he did talk about, however, were the afternoons he spent teaching his granddaughter about responsibility, focus, and precision. These lessons came in an unusual form. For most people, but for the Mitchell family, it was as natural as learning to ride a bike. The first time Sarah held a rifle, she was just 12 years old. Her small hands barely wrapped around the wooden stock, and the weight of the weapon seemed overwhelming. Her grandfather stood behind her, his weathered hands guiding hers into the proper position. "Shooting isn't about strength, Sarah," he had said in his gravelly voice. "It's about breathing, patience, and seeing what others miss." Those early lessons were filled with misses and frustration. The tin cans lined up on the fence posts seemed to mock her efforts as bullets whizzed harmlessly past them. But Thomas never showed impatience. Instead, he would adjust her stance slightly, remind her to breathe steadily, and encourage her to try again. "Every miss teaches you something," he would say. "The question is whether you're listening." As months turned into years, Sarah's skills developed remarkably. What started as a way to spend time with her grandfather became a passion that consumed her free hours. She learned about different types of firearms, ammunition, and the science behind ballistics. More importantly, she learned about herself. Her ability to remain calm under pressure, her natural hand-eye coordination, and her fierce determination to master any challenge put before her. By the time Sarah turned 16, she had become something of a local legend. Stories spread through the small community about Thomas Mitchell's granddaughter, who could hit a dime from 50 yards away. But Sarah kept her abilities mostly to herself. In a world where teenage girls were expected to be interested in fashion and dating, her unusual hobby made her feel like an outsider. Her high school years were marked by this internal conflict. During the day, she played the part of a normal student, attending classes, participating in the drama club, and maintaining good grades. But her real passion lay in those afternoon sessions with her grandfather, where she continued to push the boundaries of her abilities. Thomas recognized his granddaughter's exceptional talent and began entering her in local shooting competitions. These events were dominated by older men who had been shooting for decades. When Sarah first appeared at these competitions, she was met with polite smiles and barely concealed skepticism. A teenage girl competing against seasoned marksmen seemed like a novelty at best. The first competition was held at the county fair, a casual event that drew participants from surrounding towns. Sarah remembered the nervous flutter in her stomach as she approached the shooting line. The other competitors, all men ranging from their 30s to their 70s, gave her encouraging nods that felt more patronizing than supportive. The target was set at 100 yards, a standard distance for the event. Sarah took her position, loaded her rifle, and began the breathing exercises her grandfather had taught her. The world around her seemed to fade away as she focused on the small black circle in the distance. Her first shot was a perfect bullseye. The murmur of surprise from the crowd was audible, but Sarah remained focused. Her second shot hit the same mark. By her third shot, the fairgrounds had grown quiet, except for the occasional whisper of amazement. When the final scores were tallied, Sarah had not only won the competition but had set a new record for the event. That victory marked the beginning of Sarah's reputation in competitive shooting circles. Word spread quickly through the tight-knit community of marksmen about the young woman who could outshoot men with decades of experience. Invitations to more prestigious competitions began arriving, and Sarah found herself traveling to events across the state. Her success brought both admiration and resentment. Some competitors welcomed her warmly, recognizing genuine talent regardless of age or gender. Others viewed her presence as an unwelcome intrusion into their traditional male domain. The tension was subtle but persistent. Comments about beginners, luck, or suggestions that she should stick to more appropriate activities for young women. Sarah's grandfather watched these reactions with a mixture of pride and concern. He had taught his granddaughter to shoot, but he had also taught her to be strong in the face of adversity. "People will always find reasons to doubt you," he told her one evening as they cleaned their rifles together. "Your job isn't to convince them. Your job is to be so good that their doubts don't matter." As Sarah's senior year of high school approached, she faced important decisions about her future. College acceptance letters were arriving, and she had been offered several scholarships for academics, but her heart remained with competitive shooting, and she dreamed of representing her country in international competitions. The local shooting community had become divided in their opinions about Sarah's abilities and her place in their sport. Some embraced her as a rising star who brought positive attention to their passion. Others remained skeptical, suggesting that her success was due to luck rather than skill, or that the pressure of higher-level competition would eventually expose her limitations. It was against this backdrop of mixed acceptance and skepticism that Sarah encountered Marcus Webb, a man whose actions would test not only her shooting abilities, but also her character in ways she never expected. The stage was set for a confrontation that would prove once and for all whether Sarah's reputation was built on solid ground or simply on the charitable scoring of friendly competitions. The small-town girl who had learned to shoot tin cans in her grandfather's barn was about to face a challenge that would define her future in the sport she loved. Everything she had learned, every hour of practice, and every lesson about perseverance was about to be put to the ultimate test. Marcus Webb arrived in town on a Tuesday morning, driving a sleek black pickup truck that looked expensive and out of place among the modest vehicles that typically filled the parking spaces around the local diner. He was a man in his mid-40s with sharp features and an air of confidence that bordered on arrogance. His clothes were carefully chosen to project success: designer jeans, expensive boots, and a watch that probably cost more than most people. In town made in a month. Word traveled fast in small communities, and by lunchtime everyone knew about the stranger who had been asking questions about the local shooting competitions. Marcus had made his rounds to the gun shops, the sporting goods store, and anywhere else that catered to shooting enthusiasts. His story was consistent wherever he went. He was a wealthy businessman from Dallas who had heard about the exceptional young shooter from their town and wanted to see her abilities for himself. The local gun shop owner, Pete Harrison, was the first to feel uncomfortable about Marcus's inquiries. There was something in the man's tone that suggested his interest wasn't entirely innocent. When Marcus offered to pay for a private demonstration of Sarah's shooting skills, Pete politely declined and suggested he attend one of the regularly scheduled competitions instead. But Marcus was persistent. He visited the local shooting range and spoke with several of the regular competitors. His approach was subtle, but effective. He would express admiration for Sarah's reported abilities, while simultaneously planting seeds of doubt about whether the stories were exaggerated. "I've seen a lot of good shooters in my time," he would say with a knowing smile, "and sometimes local legends grow a bit in the telling." These comments stung the pride of the local shooting community. They had witnessed Sarah's abilities firsthand and knew the stories weren't exaggerated. Several of the men who had initially been skeptical of Sarah now found themselves defending her skills against this outsider's implied criticism. Thomas Mitchell heard about Marcus's presence in town through the informal network that connected everyone in the community. His first instinct was protective. He didn't like the idea of strangers coming around asking questions about his granddaughter. But Sarah, now 18 and confident in her abilities, was curious about this man who had traveled so far supposedly just to witness her shoot. The confrontation was arranged for the following Saturday at the town's shooting range. Word spread quickly, and what had started as a simple demonstration evolved into something resembling a showdown. Marcus had made it clear that he doubted the stories about Sarah's abilities, and the local shooting community saw this as an opportunity to prove their young champion's worth to an outsider. Sarah spent the week preparing as she always did, with methodical practice sessions under her grandfather's watchful eye. But there was an added tension this time. She could sense that this wasn't just about shooting. It was about respect, reputation, and proving herself to someone who had come, specifically to challenge her abilities. Marcus, meanwhile, was making his own preparations. He visited several gun shops in neighboring towns, examining various rifles with the careful attention of someone who knew exactly what he was looking for. His questions to the shop owners were technical and specific, focusing on older models, and asking particularly about weapons that might have mechanical issues. On Friday evening, Marcus approached Pete Harrison at the gun shop with what seemed like a straightforward request. He wanted to rent a rifle for the next day's demonstration, claiming that he hadn't brought his own weapon and wanted to participate in some friendly shooting alongside Sarah. Pete was reluctant at first, but Marcus's cash payment and seemingly legitimate interest convinced him to agree. The rifle Marcus selected was an older model that Pete kept in the back of his shop. It was a weapon that had seen better days, the kind of gun that might have been reliable once but had developed quirks and problems over the years. Pete mentioned that the rifle had been having some accuracy issues lately and offered to let Marcus use a different, more reliable weapon instead. But Marcus insisted on the older rifle, claiming he was familiar with that particular model and preferred to stick with what he knew. He paid the rental fee and left the shop with the weapon, promising to return it in good condition after the demonstration. Saturday morning arrived with clear skies and perfect shooting weather. The local shooting range was busier than usual, with spectators coming to witness what many were calling the ultimate test of Sarah's abilities. Thomas Mitchell arrived early with his granddaughter, carrying the custom rifle that had become as familiar to Sarah as her own reflection. Sarah went through her usual pre-shooting routine, checking her equipment, adjusting her stance, and running through the mental exercises that helped her focus. She was aware of the crowd that had gathered, but she had learned to block out distractions during competitions. What mattered was the target, her breathing, and the decades of training that had brought her to this moment. Marcus arrived precisely on time, carrying the rented rifle and wearing a confident smile that didn't quite reach his eyes. He greeted the gathered spectators with the practiced charm of someone accustomed to being the center of attention. When he was introduced to Sarah, his handshake was firm and his smile was wide, but there was something calculating in his gaze that made her grandfather uncomfortable. The format for the demonstration was simple. Both shooters would fire at targets, set at progressively longer distances, starting at 50 yards and working up to 200 yards. The targets were standard bullseye designs, and scoring would follow official competition rules. It was meant to be a friendly exhibition, but the tension in the air suggested that everyone present understood the stakes were higher than that, as indeed. They prepared for the first round of shooting. Marcus made a show of examining his rifle and commenting on its condition. "This old girl has seen better days," he said loudly enough for the spectators to hear. "But sometimes the older weapons have the most character. I just hope she's up to the challenge of keeping pace with such a talented young shooter." The stage was set for what would become a defining moment in Sarah's shooting career. The crowd had gathered, the weapons were loaded, and the targets were in place. What none of the spectators realized was that they were about to witness not just a demonstration of marksmanship, but a calculated attempt to humiliate a young woman whose only crime was being exceptionally good at something that challenged traditional expectations. The first round of shooting began with targets set at 50 yards, a distance that most experienced shooters would consider routine. Sarah took her position at the firing line, her movements fluid and practiced. She had performed this routine thousands of times, settling into her stance, adjusting the rifle against her shoulder, and beginning the breathing pattern that would steady her aim. Marcus positioned himself at the adjacent shooting station, making a deliberate show of struggling with his rifle. He adjusted the scope multiple times, shifted his stance repeatedly, and muttered comments about the weapon's condition that were just loud enough for nearby spectators to hear. "These older rifles can be temperamental," he said, shaking his head with apparent frustration. When the range master called for the first shot, Sarah's rifle spoke with a clean, sharp crack. The spotting scope immediately confirmed what everyone expected: a perfect bullseye, with the bullet hole precisely centered in the target's black circle. The small crowd of spectators murmured their approval, but it was the kind of restrained reaction that came from seeing excellence so often that it had become expected. Marcus's shot followed a moment later, and even before the spotting scope was turned toward his target, he was shaking his head in apparent disgust. "Just as I thought," he called out, his voice carrying a note of theatrical disappointment. "This rifle is shooting way off. Look at that, completely missed the bullseye." The spotting scope confirmed his words. Marcus's shot had indeed missed the center of the target by several inches, landing in the outer rings where amateur shooters might expect to hit. He made a show of examining his rifle again, checking the scope and muttering about mechanical problems. "I'm sorry, folks," Marcus announced to the gathering crowd. "This rifle has some serious accuracy issues. I hate to make excuses, but I'm fighting against faulty equipment here." He paused for effect, then turned toward Sarah with what appeared to be a generous smile. "Tell you what, young lady, why don't you try a few shots with this rifle? I'd be curious to see how someone with your supposed skills handles a challenging weapon." The suggestion seemed reasonable on the surface. After all, part of being a skilled marksman was the ability to adapt to different equipment and overcome mechanical challenges. Sarah's grandfather felt a twinge of unease about the proposal, but he couldn't articulate exactly why. The request seemed fair enough, and refusing it might make Sarah appear unwilling to face a legitimate challenge. Sarah accepted the rifle from Marcus with the same calm confidence she brought to every shooting situation. The weapon felt different in her hands, heavier than her custom rifle with a balance that seemed off. The stock had wear marks that suggested years of use, and the trigger had a rougher feel than what she was accustomed to. She spent a few moments familiarizing herself with the rifle, working the bolt action to get a feel for its mechanics and peering through the scope to check its clarity. Everything seemed functional, if not optimal. It was certainly not the worst rifle she had ever handled, and she had successfully shot with borrowed weapons in competitions before. The crowd had grown during the exchange, as word of the demonstration spread through the local community. Among the spectators were several of Sarah's former competitors, men who had watched her develop from a promising beginner into a formidable marksman. They observed the situation with interest, confident that their local champion could handle whatever challenge this outsider had presented. Sarah took her position with Marcus's rifle, adjusting her stance to accommodate the weapon's different balance and weight distribution. She went through her usual pre-shot routine, but with extra attention to the unfamiliar equipment. The scope seemed clear enough, though it lacked the precision adjustments of her custom rifle. Her first shot with the borrowed rifle produced another perfect bullseye. The bullet struck the target dead center, creating a hole that overlapped with her previous shot. The crowd's reaction was more enthusiastic this time. There was something impressive about watching a shooter adapt instantly to unfamiliar equipment and still maintain perfect accuracy. Marcus's reaction was subtle, but telling. For just a moment, his confident facade slipped, and those watching closely might have noticed a flicker of surprise cross his features. He had expected the rifle to cause problems for Sarah, to throw off her aim, and perhaps embarrass her in front of her hometown supporters. "Lucky shot," Marcus said, his tone still friendly but with an edge that hadn't been there before. "Let's see if you can repeat that performance. Sometimes these old rifles will throw a good shot by accident before they start causing real problems." Sarah's second shot with the borrowed rifle was even more impressive than the first. Not only did she hit the bullseye, but the bullet hole was so close to her previous shots that it created what appeared to be a single, slightly enlarged hole in the center of the target. It was the kind of precision that professional marksmen spent years trying to achieve, accomplished with an unfamiliar weapon on what Marcus had claimed was a particularly challenging rifle. The crowd's appreciation was audible now, with several spectators offering comments of admiration and amazement. But their focus was entirely on Sarah's shooting performance. They failed to notice that Marcus Webb had gone very pale, his earlier confidence replaced by something that looked suspiciously like panic. Marcus had carefully selected that particular rifle specifically because of its mechanical problems. He had tested it himself at a private range the day before, confirming that its damaged barrel and misaligned scope made accurate shooting nearly impossible. The weapon was supposed to be his secret advantage, a way to demonstrate that Sarah's reputation was built more on favorable conditions and equipment than on genuine skill. The plan had been simple and cruel. By insisting that Sarah use the faulty rifle, Marcus had expected to watch her shots scatter wildly around the target. Her inevitable poor performance would be attributed to the rifle's problems, but the seed of doubt would be planted. People would begin to wonder if Sarah's previous successes had been due to having better equipment than her competitors, or whether she simply couldn't perform under pressure. But the plan was backfiring spectacularly. Not only was Sarah hitting perfect shots with the supposedly faulty rifle, but she was doing so with a consistency that was almost supernatural. Each bullet found the exact center of the target, creating a group so tight it would have been impressive. With the finest custom rifle money could buy, Marcus found himself facing a terrifying realization. Either the rifle wasn't as damaged as he had believed, which seemed impossible given his testing the day before, or Sarah Mitchell was an even more extraordinary shooter than anyone had imagined. Neither possibility fit with his carefully constructed plan to expose her as a fraud. As Sarah prepared for her third shot with his rifle, Marcus felt sweat beginning to form on his forehead despite the cool morning air. The confident smile he had worn since arriving in town was becoming increasingly difficult to maintain. He had come to this small Texas community expecting to deflate a local legend and perhaps make himself look impressive in the process. Instead, he was witnessing a display of marksmanship that challenged everything he thought he knew about shooting. The young woman at the firing line was making shots that seemed to defy the laws of physics, using a rifle that he knew was mechanically compromised. His carefully laid trap was not only failing, it was making Sarah's abilities appear even more remarkable than before. Sarah's third shot with Marcus's rifle created what shooters call a bug hole, a grouping so tight that multiple bullets pass through nearly the same point, creating what appears to be a single, perfectly round hole in the target. The crowd fell silent as the spotting scope confirmed what everyone could see even without magnification. 3 shots that had struck the bullseye with surgical precision. Marcus Webb stared at the target in complete disbelief. His mouth had gone dry and he could feel his hands trembling slightly as the full implications of what he was witnessing began to sink in. The rifle Sarah was using was the same weapon he had personally test-fired the day before, confirming its serious accuracy problems. Yet somehow this 18-year-old girl was producing groups that would have been remarkable with the finest precision rifle available. Thomas Mitchell watched his granddaughter's performance with quiet pride, but his attention was increasingly drawn to Marcus's reactions. The older man had developed good instincts about people during his years of military service, and everything about Marcus's behavior suggested someone whose plans were going very wrong. The confident swagger that had characterized the stranger's arrival in town was rapidly being replaced by something that looked remarkably like fear. "Incredible shooting," Marcus managed to say, his voice slightly strained. "But let's not get ahead of ourselves. 50 yards is pretty close range for someone with your reputation. Why don't we move back to 100 yards and see how you handle a more challenging distance?" The suggestion seemed reasonable to the spectators, most of whom were familiar with competitive shooting standards. 100 yards was a common competition distance, and it would provide a better test of Sarah's abilities with the borrowed rifle. What they didn't know was that Marcus was desperately hoping the increased distance would expose the rifle's mechanical problems and finally produce the poor performance he had been counting on. The targets were reset at 100 yards, and Sarah once again took her position with Marcus's rifle. By now, she had become comfortable with the weapon's unique characteristics, what Marcus had interpreted as serious mechanical flaws. Sarah's experienced hands recognized as the typical quirks of an older rifle that simply required different handling techniques. The scope's adjustment mechanism was worn and imprecise, so Sarah compensated by using her understanding of ballistics and wind conditions. The trigger had a rougher break than her custom rifle, so she adjusted her finger placement and breathing timing accordingly. Where Marcus had seen insurmountable problems, Sarah saw challenges that could be overcome with skill and adaptation. Her first shot at the longer distance was another perfect bullseye. The bullet struck dead center, creating a clean hole that demonstrated not only accuracy, but also the kind of consistency that separates good shooters from great ones. The crowd's appreciation was becoming more vocal now, with several people commenting that they had never seen such precision with a borrowed rifle. Marcus felt his stomach drop as he watched the spotting scope confirm Sarah's perfect shot. He had been so certain that the increased distance would finally reveal the rifle's problems. Instead, he was watching a demonstration of marksmanship that was beginning to attract attention from people beyond the original gathering. Word was spreading through the community about the extraordinary shooting taking place at the range. That's quite impressive, Marcus said, his voice lacking its earlier confidence. But anyone can get lucky once or twice. Let's see a few more shots before we start drawing conclusions. Sarah's second and third shots at 100 yards created the same impossibly tight grouping that had characterized her shooting at the shorter distance. Each bullet found the exact center of the target, building a group that would have been noteworthy in national-level competition. The spectators were no longer simply appreciative. They were witnessing something they recognized as truly exceptional. Among the crowd, several experienced shooters were beginning to understand the full significance of what they were seeing. They recognized the rifle Marcus had rented. It was an older weapon that Pete Harrison had been trying to repair for months. The fact that Sarah was producing perfect groups with that particular rifle elevated her performance from impressive to nearly miraculous. Marcus's complexion had progressed from pale to an unhealthy shade of gray. Sweat was now visible on his forehead, and his earlier theatrical confidence had completely disappeared. He found himself trapped in a situation where every shot Sarah fired made his own shooting abilities look increasingly inadequate by comparison. The original plan had been to use the faulty rifle to discredit Sarah's reputation, then offer to show the crowd what real shooting looked like with his own properly maintained weapon. Marcus considered himself an above-average marksman, and he had expected to impress the small-town audience with shooting that would seem professional compared to Sarah's artificially poor performance with the damaged rifle. But now he faced the prospect of following Sarah's impossible accuracy with his own shooting, using a rifle that he knew was mechanically sound, but that had just produced perfect groups in the hands of someone else. The logical conclusion would be that any poor shooting on his part was due to lack of skill rather than equipment problems. Perhaps we should move to an even longer distance, Marcus suggested desperately. 200 yards would really separate the skilled shooters from the lucky ones. Thomas Mitchell stepped forward at this point, his weathered face showing concern for the first time during the demonstration. "Now hold on there, friend," he said, in a voice that carried the quiet authority of someone accustomed to being respected. "You've been talking all morning about how that rifle of yours has problems, but my granddaughter seems to be shooting just fine with it. Maybe the problem isn't with the rifle." The observation sent a murmur through the crowd as people began to reconsider what they had been witnessing. If the rifle was truly as problematic as Marcus had claimed, how was Sarah achieving such remarkable accuracy? The logical alternatives were either that Marcus had been exaggerating the rifle's problems, or that Sarah's skills were so exceptional that she could overcome mechanical issues that would stymie other shooters. Marcus realized that his carefully constructed narrative was collapsing around him. Every perfect shot Sarah fired with his supposedly faulty rifle made his own claims look more suspect. The crowd that had initially seemed sympathetic to his equipment problems was beginning to view him with the skepticism he had hoped to direct toward Sarah. "I think," Sarah said quietly, her voice carrying easily in the hushed atmosphere of the range, "that this rifle shoots just fine. Maybe you'd like to try a few shots yourself, Mr. Webb. I'd be interested to see what you can do with it." The challenge was politely stated, but everyone present understood its significance. Sarah was offering Marcus the opportunity to demonstrate his own skills with the same rifle that had supposedly been causing him problems. It was a moment of truth that would either vindicate his claims about the weapon's condition or expose them as elaborate excuses. Marcus found himself staring at the rifle in Sarah's hands, knowing that his next decision would determine whether he salvaged any dignity from the situation or suffered complete humiliation in front of the gathered crowd. The confident businessman who had arrived in town expecting to deflate a local legend now faced the prospect of having his own abilities scrutinized by people who had just witnessed shooting that bordered on the supernatural. Marcus Webb felt the weight of every pair of eyes focused on him as he reluctantly accepted the rifle back from Sarah. His hands, which had been steady when he arrived that morning full of confidence, now trembled slightly as he gripped the weapon that had just produced impossibly perfect groups in the young woman's hands. The crowd had grown substantially during the demonstration. Word had spread through the small community about the remarkable shooting taking place at the range, and people had left their Saturday morning activities to witness what was being described as an extraordinary display of marksmanship. Among the newer arrivals were several local law enforcement officers, military veterans, and other experienced shooters who understood the significance of what they were observing. Marcus positioned himself at the firing line, acutely aware that his every movement was being scrutinized by people who now had reason to doubt his earlier claims about the rifle's condition. He went through the motions of examining the weapon, checking the scope and adjusting his stance, but his actions lacked the confident authority he had displayed earlier. The target at 100 yards seemed impossibly small from his current perspective. What had looked like a reasonable distance when Sarah was shooting now felt like an enormous challenge. Marcus knew he was a competent marksman. He had been shooting recreationally for years and considered himself above average among weekend enthusiasts. But the pressure of the situation and the knowledge that he was expected to match or at least approach Sarah's perfect accuracy was overwhelming. His first shot missed the bullseye entirely, striking the target several inches to the right of center in what would be considered a decent shot for casual recreation, but was embarrassingly poor compared to Sarah's surgical precision. The miss sent a ripple of murmurs through the crowd, and Marcus felt his face burning with embarrassment. "Must be the wind," Marcus said weakly, though the morning air was virtually still. He made a show of adjusting the scope, even though he knew the problem wasn't with the equipment. The rifle that Sarah had used to create perfect groups was mechanically sound. It was his own shooting abilities that were being exposed as inadequate. His second shot was marginally better, hitting the outer edge of the bullseye, but still nowhere near the dead center accuracy that Sarah had demonstrated with apparent ease. Marcus realized with growing horror that he was not only failing to match Sarah's performance, but was actually proving her superiority with every shot he fired. Thomas Mitchell watched the proceedings with a mixture of satisfaction and pity. He had recognized Marcus as a troublemaker from the moment the man arrived in town, but seeing him publicly humiliated provided less pleasure than the old soldier had expected. There was something pathetic about watching someone's carefully constructed facade crumble so completely. Sarah observed Marcus's shooting with professional interest rather than malicious enjoyment. She could see that he was actually a decent marksman who was being undermined by his own tension and unrealistic expectations. Under normal circumstances, his shooting would have been respectable, but following her demonstration with the same rifle, his performance looked amateurish by comparison. "The rifle seems to be working fine now," Thomas Mitchell commented dryly, his words carrying clearly across the range. "Maybe it just needed the right touch." The comment drew chuckles from several spectators, and Marcus felt his humiliation deepen. He realized that continuing to shoot would only make his situation worse, but stopping now would be an admission of defeat that would haunt him long after he left this small Texas town. After Marcus's fifth shot, another miss of the bullseye's center, Sarah stepped forward with an expression of genuine concern. "Mr. Webb," she said quietly, "would you like me to take a look at your shooting stance? Sometimes small adjustments can make a big difference." The offer was made with sincere helpfulness, without a trace of mockery or condescension. But to Marcus it represented the ultimate humiliation. The young woman he had come to discredit was now offering to coach him in the basics of marksmanship. The crowd fell silent, waiting to see how he would respond to this unexpected gesture. Marcus's face had progressed through several shades of red and was now settling into a mottled purple that suggested his blood pressure was reaching dangerous levels. "I don't need shooting lessons from a child," he snapped, his composure finally cracking completely. "There's obviously something wrong with this demonstration. Nobody shoots that accurately with a rifle like this." The accusation hung in the air like a challenge. Marcus was essentially claiming that Sarah had somehow cheated, or that the demonstration had been rigged in her favor. It was a serious charge that impugned not only Sarah's integrity, but also the honesty of everyone who had witnessed and organized the event. Thomas Mitchell's expression hardened at the implication that his granddaughter was somehow engaging in deception. Several other spectators began voicing their objections to Marcus's suggestion, pointing out that he had personally selected the rifle and that the shooting had taken place under completely open conditions with multiple witnesses. "Maybe," said Pete Harrison, the gun shop owner who had rented the rifle to Marcus. "The problem isn't with the rifle or with Sarah's shooting. Maybe the problem is that you bit off more than you could chew when you came here looking to prove something." The comment struck home because it captured what everyone was thinking, but had been too polite to say directly. Marcus Webb had arrived in their community as an outsider, making claims about their local champion's abilities, and his own shooting had failed to support his implied superiority. Sarah, meanwhile, had remained calm throughout the increasingly tense exchange. She understood that Marcus's accusations stemmed from embarrassment rather than genuine belief in any wrongdoing. But she also recognized that her reputation and integrity were being challenged in front of her community, and that some response was necessary. "Mr. Webb," she said, her voice steady and clear, "if you think there's something unusual about my shooting, I'd be happy to repeat the demonstration with any rifle you choose. You can inspect the weapon beforehand, you can load the ammunition yourself, and you can select the targets and distances. I'm confident that the results will be the same." The offer was made with quiet dignity, but it represented a complete reversal of the morning's power dynamic. Instead of Sarah being challenged to prove herself, Marcus was now being invited to set the terms for a test of her abilities. It was clear that she had complete confidence in her skills and was willing to submit to any reasonable verification process. Marcus realized that he had painted himself into a corner from which there was no graceful escape. Accepting Sarah's offer would likely result in another demonstration of her superior marksmanship, further emphasizing his own inadequacies. But declining the offer would make him appear afraid to put his accusations to the test. The crowd waited, in tense silence, for Marcus's response, understanding that his next words would determine whether the morning's events concluded with dignified resolution or escalated into something more unpleasant. The confident businessman who had arrived, expecting to expose a fraud, now faced the prospect of being exposed as one himself. Marcus Webb stood frozen at the firing line, the weight of dozens of expectant stares pressing down on him like a physical force. His carefully constructed plan had not just failed, it had backfired so spectacularly that he was now the one being challenged to prove his legitimacy. The rifle in his hands felt impossibly heavy, and he could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity before Marcus finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I think there's been a misunderstanding here," he began, his earlier bravado completely gone. "I never meant to suggest that anyone was cheating or being dishonest. But the damage was already done. His accusation had been heard by everyone present, and his attempt to backtrack only made him appear more desperate." Thomas Mitchell stepped forward, his weathered face showing the kind of controlled anger that came from decades of military discipline. "Son," Thomas said, his voice carrying the quiet authority of someone who had faced down enemies in actual combat, "I've been watching people shoot for more years than you've been alive. I've seen marksmen in war zones, competition shooters at the highest levels, and everything in between. What you witnessed here today wasn't luck, and it wasn't trickery. It was pure skill, developed through years of dedication and practice." The old soldier's words carried weight with everyone present. His military service was well known in the community, and his endorsement of Sarah's abilities meant more than any formal certification could have. Several veterans in the crowd nodded their agreement, recognizing the voice of someone who understood excellence when he saw it. Marcus realized that his position was becoming increasingly untenable. Not only had he failed to discredit Sarah, but he had managed to unite the entire community against him through his unfounded accusations. The people who had initially been willing to give him the benefit of the doubt now viewed him as someone who couldn't accept being outclassed by a young woman. "Perhaps," Sarah said quietly, "we should call this demonstration complete. I think everyone has seen what they came to see." Her words were diplomatic, offering Marcus a graceful exit from a situation that had become increasingly humiliating for him. But even this gesture of mercy seemed to sting his pride. The idea that an 18-year-old girl was showing him compassion in front of a crowd of witnesses was almost more than his ego could bear. "This isn't over," Marcus muttered, though his words lacked conviction. "I'll be looking into this more carefully." The threat sounded empty even to him, and it drew looks of disgust from several spectators. Pete Harrison, the gun shop owner, stepped forward to reclaim his rifle from Marcus's hands. "I think you've seen enough for one day," Pete said firmly. "And I think we've all seen enough of you." The crowd began to disperse, but not before many people approached Sarah to congratulate her on the remarkable shooting they had witnessed. Word of the morning's events would spread quickly through the community and beyond, adding another chapter to the growing legend of the young woman who could outshoot anyone who challenged her. Marcus found himself standing alone near his expensive pickup truck, watching as people continued to gather around Sarah and her grandfather. The confident businessman who had arrived expecting to deflate a local legend was now a figure of ridicule, exposed as someone whose own abilities couldn't match his arrogant claims. As he climbed into his truck, Marcus caught sight of Sarah in his rearview mirror. She was laughing at something her grandfather had said, completely relaxed and at ease despite the morning's tension. There was no malice in her demeanor, no sense of triumph over a defeated opponent. She simply appeared to be a young woman who had done what she did best and was now enjoying time with her family and friends. The sight was somehow more devastating to Marcus than any gloating or celebration would have been. Sarah's casual dismissal of his challenge, her apparent indifference to his humiliation, drove home the truth that he had been trying to deny all morning. She was simply in a different class as a marksman, and his attempts to diminish her abilities had only served to highlight his own limitations. As Marcus drove out of town, he passed the sign that welcomed visitors to the small Texas community. The same sign he had driven past that morning, full of confidence and plans for exposing what he assumed was an inflated local legend. Now it seemed to mock him as he retreated from a confrontation that had revealed him to be exactly the kind of person he had accused others of being, someone whose reputation exceeded his actual abilities. Behind him, the community settled, back into its normal Saturday routine, but with a new story to tell. The tale of the outsider who had come to challenge their local champion and had instead provided the most convincing demonstration yet of her extraordinary abilities would be retold for years to come. Sarah spent the rest of the day at the range, not because she needed to practice, but because she genuinely enjoyed the activity that had brought her so much recognition. The morning's confrontation was already becoming a distant memory, just another in the long series of challenges she had faced and overcome on her path to becoming one of the most skilled marksmen anyone in the area had ever seen. Thomas Mitchell watched his granddaughter with quiet pride, knowing that the lessons he had taught her went far beyond marksmanship. She had handled the morning's pressure with grace and dignity, proving that her character was every bit as impressive as her shooting skills. The young girl who had struggled to hold her first rifle had grown into a woman who could face down any challenge with confidence and composure. The faulty gun that Marcus Webb had chosen as his secret weapon had instead become the instrument of Sarah's greatest triumph. His attempt to expose her as a fraud had backfired completely, providing instead the most compelling evidence yet that her reputation was built on genuine, extraordinary talent. In the years that followed, Sarah would go on to compete at the highest levels of marksmanship, eventually representing her country in international competitions. But she would always remember the Saturday morning when a stranger's attempt to humiliate her had instead provided the most satisfying vindication of her abilities she had ever experienced. The story of the man who offered her a faulty gun, expecting to watch her fail, only to go pale as she hit perfect marks each time, became a legend in competitive shooting circles. It served as a reminder that true skill cannot be diminished by inferior equipment, and that attempts to sabotage excellence often serve only to make it shine more brightly. Marcus Webb never returned to the small Texas town, and his name was eventually forgotten by most of the people who had witnessed his humiliation. But Sarah Mitchell's name would be remembered for generations, not just for her incredible marksmanship, but for the grace and dignity with which she had handled one of the greatest challenges to her reputation she would ever face.